There's a reason they put bracelets on babies born in hospitals. I am that reason. In 1968, on a tired and careless night, I mixed up two newborns. One was my daughter's baby. Now, years later, my granddaughter needs a bone marrow transplant, and I'm forced to reveal this terrible secret. My name is Margaret Williams, but everyone calls me Maggie. I worked as a nurse at Memorial General Hospital in Springfield for over 40 years. I was there when they introduced electronic medical records, when they built the new East Wing, when they changed the color of our uniforms from white to baby blue. I saw thousands of babies come into this world. I held them in my arms, cleaned them, wrapped them in those little striped hospital blankets, and handed them to their mamas. I was good at my job. At least, that's what everyone believed. December 14th, 1968, was the night that changed everything. We had a terrible snowstorm, and half the staff couldn't make it to the hospital. The roads were buried under 18 inches of snow, and the wind howled like a wounded animal outside the windows. I was working a double shift, already on my 16th hour. My eyes were heavy, my mind foggy from too much coffee and too little sleep. That night, two baby girls were born within 20 minutes of each other. One to my daughter Ellen, who had gotten pregnant right out of high school and was raising the baby alone. Ellen was just 18, scared and brave all at once. Her boyfriend Tommy had enlisted in the Army and was already in Vietnam when she found out she was expecting. She never told him about the baby. She said she didn't want him distracted over there where boys were dying every day. But I knew the truth. She was afraid he'd reject her, reject their child. The other baby was born to a woman named Diana Blackwood, who came from the wealthy part of town with her husband James in their brand new Cadillac. The Blackwoods owned half the businesses in Springfield. James was a banker, always dressed in expensive suits, and Diana wore pearls even while in labor. They'd been trying for a baby for 10 years, and this was their miracle. Back then, our nursery system was nothing like today's secure setups. Both infants were wrapped in white hospital blankets. Both had been wiped clean and given their first bath, their soft new skin still pink from the warm water. Both were wearing the standard-issue white knit caps that covered their hair. The identifying bracelets were thin plastic bands with handwritten cards slicked inside, one for the wrist, one for the ankle. In the chaos of that night, with alarms blaring from other rooms and nurses running to help with emergencies, I took both infants to be cleaned and weighed. Standard procedure was to keep the identification bracelets on during this process, but one of the babies, I'm still not sure which one, had a bracelet that was too loose. I removed it, intending to replace it immediately with a tighter one to prevent it from slipping off and getting lost. I placed it on the counter. Then a code blue was called in room 304. The attending nurse had slipped on ice in the parking lot and broken her ankle, so we were already short-staffed. "Maggie, we need you now!" someone shouted from the hallway. Instinctively, I rushed to help, leaving the two infants in their bassinets. When I returned 15 minutes later, I realized my terrible mistake. I had left the loose bracelet on the counter, and now I couldn't remember which baby it belonged to. Both infants were sleeping peacefully, looking so similar in their white caps and blankets. I tried to recall which bassinet I had placed each baby in, but with the stress and exhaustion, everything had become a blur. I made a decision in that split second, a decision that would change 4 lives forever. I reattached the bracelet to what I thought was the right baby, but deep down I wasn't sure, and that uncertainty would haunt me for decades. I still remember the sound of the plastic bracelets clicking shut around those tiny wrists. 2 innocent babies who would go home with the wrong families, all because of me. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst was what I did next. Nothing. I said nothing. And now, over 50 years later, that silence might cost my granddaughter her life, or at least the girl I've always thought of as my granddaughter. What I didn't know then was that a tiny birthmark would later confirm my worst fears, and that decades later, when death came knocking, I would finally have to face what I'd done. I realized what I had done about an hour later, standing there in the nursery, looking at the two sleeping babies. A cold feeling washed over me, like I'd stepped outside into that December snow. I checked the charts again, looked at the bracelets, and the terrible possibility crystallized in my mind. I had no way to be 100% certain that the babies were wearing the correct identification. I should have reported it immediately. That's what any responsible nurse would have done. But I froze. Ellen had already bonded with the baby she thought was hers. She was so happy, despite all the hardships she'd faced. She dropped out of school, been kicked out by her father, moved in with me. That baby was the only bright spot in her world. And the Blackwoods, they were already making plans for their perfect daughter's perfect life. They'd brought a pink cashmere blanket for her, had a nursery painted by some fancy decorator, were talking about trust funds and private schools, while the baby was barely an hour old. How could I tell them what I'd done? I'd lose my job, my reputation. The hospital might get sued. Ellen would be devastated. The Blackwoods would be furious. No, I told myself, it would cause too much pain to too many people. Besides, I wasn't even completely sure I had mixed them up. Maybe the babies were exactly where they should be. Maybe my exhausted mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew there was a real possibility I had made a terrible mistake. I told myself I would fix it later, find a way to be certain. But days passed, then weeks, and soon it was too late. The babies had settled into their homes, their families had fallen in love with them. How could I tear them away based on a suspicion, a fear that might not even be founded? So I stayed silent. I watched as Ellen struggled to make ends meet, working as a waitress while taking night classes to finish high school. I babysat little Chloe whenever Ellen needed me, which was often. I changed her diapers, sang her lullabies, rocked her to sleep. Meanwhile, I caught glimpses of the Blackwood baby, Victoria, around town. At the pediatrician's office, where I sometimes filled in. At the park, where her nanny would bring her to play. I'd find excuses to go over and observe her. Was there something familiar in her features? Could I see traces of Ellen or Tommy in her face? But babies change so quickly in those early months, their features constantly evolving. Any resemblance I thought I saw could have been my guilty imagination. Years passed. Chloe grew into a sweet, determined little girl who loved books and always tried to help Ellen around our small apartment. Victoria became the princess of Springfield, always in pretty dresses, taking ballet lessons by age 3. 2 girls born on the same night, living completely different lives, and possibly in the wrong families because of me. When Chloe was about 5, I noticed something that made my heart stop. She had a small birthmark behind her right ear, a tiny light brown patch shaped like a crescent moon. I had never noticed it before because it was usually covered by her hair. But one day while I was helping her bathe, I saw it clearly. The next week, I volunteered at the spring festival at the country club, where I knew the Blackwoods would be. I positioned myself near the children's games, and when Victoria ran past me, I caught a glimpse of her right ear. No birthmark. It wasn't conclusive proof. The birthmark could have come from Tommy, Chloe's biological father, but it was enough to intensify my suspicions. Still, I kept my secret. What good would it do to disrupt these children's lives? They were happy, loved, thriving in their respective families. And with each passing year, it became harder and harder to imagine revealing the truth. So I carried my burden in silence, watching these two girls grow up from afar, wondering if I had altered the courses of their lives forever with my careless mistake on that snowy night. And I might have carried this secret to my grave, if not for what happened 3 months ago. 3 months ago, when everything finally caught up with me, when the past came knocking on my door, demanding to be acknowledged, when I learned that sometimes secrets don't just hurt the soul, they can kill the body too. How could I have known that the word leukemia would force me to finally unravel the web of lies I've been spinning for over half a century?
The years went by, and I watched both girls grow up. My daughter's child, who might possibly be Diana Blackwood's biological daughter, was named Chloe. She was raised in our modest home on Maple Street, went to Springfield High, and worked part-time at the Dairy Queen since she was 16. She was smart and hard-working, just like Ellen, and eventually became a fourth-grade teacher at the same elementary school she'd attended as a child. Chloe had Ellen's determination and my practicality, but there were differences in her appearance that sometimes raised questions. While Ellen and I both had green eyes, Chloe's were a deep brown. Ellen had naturally wavy hair, while Chloe's was straight as a pin. People would sometimes remark on this, and Ellen would laugh and say, "She must take after her daddy." If only they knew the terrible possibility that haunted me. When Chloe was 7, Ellen married a kind man named Bill who worked at the auto plant. He adopted Chloe legally and gave her his last name. They had 2 more children together, Chloe's siblings, though possibly not by blood. Our family grew, and my secret seemed less important with each passing year. Chloe was happy, loved, thriving. That was what mattered, wasn't it? The other girl, Victoria, was raised by the Blackwoods with every privilege money could buy. Private school at St. Margaret's Academy, horseback riding lessons, summer camps in Martha's Vineyard. From a distance, I watched her grow into a beautiful, privileged young woman, driving her convertible Mustang to cheerleading practice. I noticed that Victoria had green eyes, like Ellen and me. Was that just coincidence or evidence of our connection? Her hair was wavy too, unlike Diana's sleek black hair or James's thinning straight hair. But again, these traits could have come from other family members, from grandparents I'd never seen. I couldn't be certain. The Blackwoods had another child 3 years after Victoria, a boy they named Matthew. He was a surprise. They'd believed they couldn't conceive again. Matthew had the same dark brown eyes as his mother Diana, the same strong jaw as his father James. He was unmistakably a Blackwood. And if my suspicions were correct, he was the biological brother of Chloe, not Victoria. I tried to convince myself that maybe it was better this way. Both girls were loved. Both had good lives, just different ones. What good would it do to disrupt their worlds? So I kept my secret, year after year, decade after decade. I retired from nursing, became a widow when my Henry passed from a heart attack, and moved into a smaller house. Life went on. I did have moments of weakness. When Chloe was 12 and had pneumonia, I wondered if her biological family's medical history might be important for her doctors to know. When Victoria was featured in the local paper for winning a regional piano competition, I cut out the article and kept it hidden in my Bible. I'd look at it sometimes, wondering if her musical talent came from Ellen's side of the family. My father had been quite the piano player in his day. There was one time I almost broke my silence. Victoria was about 16, and I saw her arguing with Diana in the parking lot of the grocery store. Diana slapped her. Not hard, but it shocked me.
I wanted to run over there to protect her, to tell Diana she had no right to hit this girl who might be my biological granddaughter. But, of course, I had no proof, only suspicions. I had no rights to Victoria at all. Victoria and Chloe crossed paths occasionally. Springfield isn't a huge town. They went to different schools, moved in different circles, but they must have seen each other at the mall, at the movie theater, at town events. Did they ever feel a strange connection? Did they ever notice the odd coincidence that they were born on the same day, in the same hospital? I'll never know. What I do know is that my possible mistake all those years ago may have created two parallel lives, two roads diverging from a single point. And now, decades later, those roads were about to converge again in a way none of us could have imagined. After all these years, the truth, or at least my suspicions, was finally going to come out, and it would start with three terrifying words: "You have leukemia." But it wasn't just Chloe's life hanging in the balance. It was our entire family's identity and the terrible possibility that the only person who could save her was a brother she never knew she had.
Then, 3 months ago, everything changed. Chloe, now 54, was diagnosed with leukemia. She needed a bone marrow transplant, and the doctors at Springfield Memorial were looking for family matches. Ellen was tested but wasn't compatible. They asked about other blood relatives. The diagnosis came out of nowhere. Chloe had been feeling tired, bruising easily, running fevers that wouldn't break. She thought it was just stress from teaching, maybe early menopause. By the time she went to the doctor, the cancer was already advanced. Acute myeloid leukemia, they called it. I remembered that term from my nursing days. It wasn't good. I sat with her during that first appointment when the doctor explained the treatment plan. Chemotherapy first, to try to put the cancer into remission. Then, ideally, a bone marrow transplant from a compatible donor. Family members were always the first choice, the doctor explained. Siblings had a 25% chance of being a match. Parents, somewhat less. The closer the genetic connection, the better. Ellen went to be tested immediately. So did Bill, though the doctor said step-parents were rarely matches. Chloe's half-siblings were tested too. Everyone in the family wanted to help, was desperate to do something, anything. I sat there in the waiting room while they had their blood drawn, my heart pounding in my chest. If my suspicions were correct, if Chloe was actually Diana Blackwood's biological daughter, then Ellen wouldn't be a match. None of them would, because Chloe wouldn't be biologically related to any of us. "Mom, do you think my father might help?" Chloe asked Ellen one evening while I was visiting. We were sitting around Ellen's kitchen table, the same table where we'd celebrated birthdays and Christmases and graduations, the table where Chloe had done her homework, where she'd announced her engagement, where she told us about her teaching job. Now it was where we gathered to talk about her cancer. "I know you don't like talking about him, but this is my life we're talking about." Ellen looked uncomfortable. She'd always told Chloe that her father was a young man who wasn't ready for responsibility, a boy from the football team who'd moved to California after graduation. In reality, she didn't even know who the father was. She'd had a brief relationship during a rebellious phase. "I don't think we can find him, honey," Ellen said softly, squeezing Chloe's hand. "Well, what about other relatives? Aunt Sarah, cousins?" Chloe was desperate, her normally cheerful face drawn with worry. The chemotherapy had already taken her hair, left her skin pale and translucent. She looked so fragile sitting there, this woman who had always been so strong. I sat there at Ellen's kitchen table, my heart pounding in my chest, the weight of my suspicion crushing me. If Chloe was going to find a match, it might not be in our family, not if my worst fears were true. It was then that I first considered the possibility that the Blackwoods might be her biological family. If that were true,
then Matthew, Diana and James's biological son, might be Chloe's full biological brother. He might be a match for her bone marrow. But there was still the question of whether my suspicions were even correct. I had never been 100% certain that I had switched the babies. It had been a possibility that haunted me for decades, but not a certainty. And now, with Chloe's life at stake, I needed to know the truth once and for all. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced around my small living room, weighing my options. If I spoke up now, I would have to admit that I'd kept this terrible secret for 54 years. I would have to confess to Ellen, to Chloe, to the Blackwoods that I might have robbed them all of their rightful families. I would face their anger, their shock, possibly even legal repercussions. But if I stayed silent and Chloe died because she couldn't find a matching donor, how could I live with myself then? I had to find out the truth, but I couldn't just blurt out my suspicions without any proof. I needed to confirm whether Chloe and Victoria had indeed been switched at birth before I threw everyone's lives into chaos. The next morning, I made a decision. I would try to get DNA samples from both Chloe and Victoria to see if they were related to the families that raised them. It wouldn't be easy, but it was the only way to know for sure before I took the drastic step of revealing my decades-old secret. As I looked at Chloe's calendar on Ellen's fridge marking chemotherapy appointments, at the pill organizers and medical paperwork scattered across the counter, I knew my time was running out. I had to act quickly. And really, when I put it that way, was it even a choice at all? Little did I know that sneaking around collecting DNA samples would be the easy part. The hardest challenge was still to come. Looking into the eyes of the woman who was actually my biological granddaughter and telling her that her entire life had been built on my lie. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced around my small living room, looking at old photographs and frames and albums. There was Chloe as a baby in her pink onesie, as a toddler with pigtails at the county fair, graduating from high school in her cap and gown, at her wedding at First Baptist Church. She was my granddaughter in every way that mattered. I had held her hand when she took her first steps, baked her birthday cakes with rainbow sprinkles, attended every school play and softball game. I loved her with all my heart. But now her life was at stake, and my secret might stand in the way of her survival. I pulled out my old photo albums, the ones that chronicled our family history. There was Ellen as a baby with my green eyes and her father's dimpled chin. There was Henry and me on our wedding day, young and hopeful. There was Ellen's graduation, before she got pregnant, when the future still seemed wide open. And then there was Chloe, filling page after page with her childhood milestones. I studied those photos of Chloe carefully, looking for any resemblance to the Blackwoods. Her brown eyes, so unlike our family's green ones. Her straight hair, when everyone in my family had waves. That birthmark behind her ear. Had I ever seen anything like it in the Blackwood family? I couldn't be sure. I needed proof, one way or the other. I needed to know if my suspicions were correct before I turned everyone's lives upside down. But how could I get DNA samples from both families without raising questions? Then I remembered something. Victoria Blackwood Patterson was now a high-profile attorney in Springfield. She had recently been featured in the local paper for winning a major case. The article mentioned that she would be speaking at a charity luncheon at the country club this weekend, a cancer research fundraiser, ironically enough. I could attend the luncheon, maybe find a way to get a sample from Victoria, a discarded coffee cup or water glass, something with her DNA on it. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was a start. As for Chloe's DNA, that would be easier. I often helped her clean her apartment now that she was so weak from the chemotherapy. I could easily find a hairbrush, a toothbrush, something I could take without her noticing. It felt terrible sneaking around like this, planning to take DNA samples from my own family. But I had to know the truth before I said anything. I had to be certain. The next day, I signed up for the charity luncheon. It was expensive, almost a week's worth of my pension. But this was Chloe's life we were talking about. I would have paid 10 times that amount. That same afternoon, I visited Chloe's apartment, bringing her some homemade soup. As expected, she was exhausted from her latest round of chemo. I convinced her to lie down while I tidied up a bit. "You're an angel, Grandma," she said, her voice weak but grateful. "I don't know what I'd do without you." The guilt hit me like a physical blow. Here she was, thanking me, trusting me, while I was sneaking around behind her back. But I reminded myself why I was doing this: to help her, to save her life if possible. While she napped, I found her hairbrush. There were a few strands of hair caught in the bristles. Not many, since the chemotherapy had taken most of her hair, but hopefully enough. I carefully collected them in a small plastic bag I brought for this purpose, feeling like the worst kind of thief. The charity luncheon was 2 days later. I wore my best dress, the navy blue one I usually save for church on Easter Sunday. I felt out of place among the country club crowd, with their designer outfits and perfectly coiffed hair. But I was there for a purpose, not to socialize. Victoria gave a short speech about the importance of cancer research funding. She was poised and articulate, with a natural charisma that commanded attention. I couldn't help but wonder if those qualities came from Ellen, who had always been the smartest, most well-spoken person in any room. After the speeches, there was a buffet lunch. I watched Victoria carefully from my table near the back of the room. She drank from a water glass, ate a salad, dabbed her mouth with a napkin, all potential sources of DNA if I could get to them before the waitstaff cleared them away. When Victoria got up to speak with someone across the room, leaving her table momentarily unattended, I saw my chance. I walked over, pretending to admire the floral centerpiece, and quickly slipped her used napkin into my purse. It wasn't until I drove home, the napkin safely stored in another plastic bag, that I allowed myself to think about what would happen next. I needed to get these samples tested, but how? I couldn't just walk into a lab and ask for DNA comparison without raising suspicions. Then I remembered Jack Patterson, Victoria's husband. He was the head of surgery at Memorial Hospital, the same hospital where I'd worked for 40 years. I still had friends there, including Sarah in the lab, who owed me a favor from way back. Maybe, just maybe, I could get this done quietly, without anyone asking too many questions. I called Sarah that evening, carefully crafting a story about a medical research project I was helping with involving anonymous DNA samples. Sarah was skeptical at first, but our decades of friendship and the fact that I had once covered for her for a major workplace mistake eventually won her over. She said, "Bring them by tomorrow. I can't promise quick results, but I'll do my best." Now all I could do was wait. Wait to find out if my terrible suspicion was correct. Wait to see if I had indeed switched these babies 54 years ago. Wait to discover if Matthew Blackwood, who had no idea of my suspicions, might be the key to saving Chloe's life. The weight of these possibilities sat heavy on my shoulders as I drove home in the gathering dusk, the 2 DNA samples, one from each family, tucked safely in my purse. I thought the worst moment would be confirming my suspicions. I was wrong. Nothing could prepare me for what would happen when I finally confessed to Victoria Blackwood Patterson that she had been raised by the wrong family her entire life. A week later, Sarah called me with the results. I was sitting in my living room, flipping through TV channels without really seeing anything, when my phone rang. "Maggie?" Sarah's voice was tentative. "I have those results you wanted." My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Yes? Well, it's..." Interesting. The samples you gave me, they're definitely not related. What do you mean? I asked, though I already knew. I mean, these two individuals are not biologically related. Not siblings, not parent and child, not even distant cousins. There's no genetic connection at all. I closed my eyes, letting the confirmation of my fears wash over me. Thank you, Sarah. This helps a lot. Maggie, she said hesitantly, what is this really about? These aren't random samples for a research project, are they? I can't explain right now, but I promise this is important. Life or death important. After we hung up, I sat in my chair for a long time, processing what I now knew for certain. Chloe was not Ellen's biological daughter, which meant Victoria was not Diana and James Blackwood's biological daughter. I had indeed switched those babies 54 years ago, and now that mistake might cost Chloe her life if we couldn't find a matching bone marrow donor. The Blackwoods were the key. If Chloe was truly their biological daughter, then Matthew, their son born 3 years after Victoria, would be Chloe's full biological brother. He might be able to donate the bone marrow she so desperately needed. But how could I approach them? How could I tell them that their beloved daughter, Victoria, wasn't biologically theirs, that a woman they'd never met, who was now fighting for her life, was actually their flesh and blood? I needed to speak with Victoria first. She was a lawyer, trained to deal with difficult situations, and from what I observed over the years, she had inherited Ellen's head-leveledness, her ability to process shocking information without falling apart. The next morning, I drove my old Buick to the offices of Patterson, Blackwood & Klein, the law firm where Victoria was a senior partner. The receptionist looked skeptical when I requested a meeting without an appointment, but I insisted it was a personal matter of grave importance. Tell her it's Margaret Williams. I was a nurse at Memorial when she was born. 20 minutes later, I was shown into Victoria's elegant corner office. She rose from behind her large desk, extending her hand politely. Mrs. Williams, what can I do for you today? I took a deep breath and began. Miss Blackwood of Patterson, I have something very difficult to tell you. Something I've kept secret for 54 years. But before I do, I need to ask, have you ever been tested for any unusual genetic markers, any medical conditions that don't run in the Blackwood family history? She frowned, clearly confused by this strange opening. I'm not sure that's any of your business, Mrs. Williams. Please, it's important. Life or death important. Something in my face must have convinced her because after a moment, she nodded slowly. As a matter of fact, yes. When I was pregnant with my first child, they found that I'm a carrier for a rare blood disorder that doesn't appear anywhere in the Blackwood family medical history. The doctors assumed it must have come from some distant ancestor. She paused. Why do you ask? Because that disorder might be in my family, I said quietly. In Ellen Williams's family, to be precise. Victoria's frown deepened. Ellen Williams? The paralegal? What does she have to do with anything? I took a deep breath and told her everything. About the snowstorm, the babies, the loose bracelet, about my decades of suspicion, about the DNA test that had just confirmed those suspicions, about Chloe's leukemia and her need for a bone marrow donor. She listened without interrupting, her face growing paler with each revelation. When I finished, she stood and walked to the window, her back to me. She said, You're telling me that I'm not actually a Blackwood, that my parents, the people who raised me, who loved me, who gave me everything, are not my biological parents. Biologically, no, but in every other way that matters, they were your parents. They loved you. They raised you. And this woman, Chloe, She's the Blackwood's biological daughter. My brother Matthew is actually her brother, not mine. Yes. And he might be able to save her life if he's a match for the bone marrow donation. Victoria turned back to me, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. Why should I believe any of this? You could be making it all up. I have the DNA results, and if you need more proof, we can run more tests. But deep down, I think you know I'm telling the truth. Haven't there been moments when you felt different from your family, when you couldn't understand where certain traits came from? She didn't answer, but I could see the recognition in her eyes. The carrier status for that rare blood disorder. Perhaps other small things she'd noticed over the years but dismissed. She needed to think, she said finally. This is too much to process all at once. I understand, I said, standing to leave. But please think quickly. Chloe doesn't have much time. As I reached the door, Victoria's voice stopped me. Mrs. Williams? Yes? This Ellen Williams. She's my biological mother. Yes, I said softly. What is she like? The question caught me off guard. She's kind, hardworking, smart as a whip, put herself through community college while raising Chloe alone. She loves old movies and makes the best apple pie you've ever tasted. She's the strongest person I know. She nodded slowly, absorbing this. And Chloe, what is she like? She's a fourth-grade teacher. The kids adore her. She has a way of making everyone feel special, important. She volunteers at the animal shelter on weekends, or did before she got sick. She loves to read, especially mysteries. Victoria was silent for a long moment. Then she straightened her shoulders, a gesture so like Ellen's that it made my heart ache. I'll need to verify your claims, of course. More DNA tests, and I'll need to think about how to handle this, especially with my family. But if what you're saying is true, if Matthew can help save this woman's life, I'll speak with him. Thank you, I whispered. As I left her office, I felt a strange mixture of relief and dread. The truth was finally out, or beginning to come out. But the hardest conversations were still ahead. I still had to tell Ellen and Chloe, and the Blackwoods would have to be told as well. I had finally taken the first step toward righting my decades-old wrong, but the journey ahead would be painful for everyone involved. When the knock finally came at my door 3 days later, I never expected that the woman standing there with tears in her eyes would say the 7 words that would change everything. The tests confirm it. You were right all along.
Victoria asked for a week to verify my claims and decide how to proceed. She insisted on new DNA tests, more comprehensive than the ones I had secretly arranged. She needed to be absolutely certain before she turned her family's world upside down. I understood her caution. This wasn't just about saving Chloe's life, though that was paramount to me. It was about fundamental questions of identity, of family, of belonging. Victoria needed time to process the revelation that the people who raised her weren't her biological parents, that somewhere across town was a woman who had given birth to her, who shared her blood. Those 7 days of waiting were the longest of my life. I visited Chloe daily, watching her grow weaker as the aggressive chemotherapy ravaged her body in an attempt to kill the cancer cells. The doctors were talking about more drastic measures if a donor couldn't be found soon. Ellen called me every evening with updates, her voice increasingly desperate. The National Registry hasn't found a match yet, she told me one night. The doctor says we're running out of time. I wanted to tell her everything right then, to confess my suspicions, now confirmed, to give her hope that Matthew Blackwood might be the donor Chloe needed, but I had promised Victoria I would wait. This had to be handled carefully, with respect for both families. Finally, on the 7th day, Victoria called me. The tests confirm everything, she said, her voice steady but strained. I've spoken with Matthew.
I didn't tell him everything, just that there's a leukemia patient who might be related to our family, who needs a bone marrow donor urgently. He's agreed to be tested. Thank you, I said, relief washing over me. When? Tomorrow morning. I've arranged for him to go to Memorial at 9 a.m. She paused. I think it's time to tell the others. My parents, my adoptive parents, are both gone now, but Matthew deserves to know the full truth. And of course, Ellen and Chloe need to be told as well. We agreed to meet the next day at Victoria's house, after Matthew's testing. Victoria would bring Matthew, and I would bring Ellen and Chloe. It would be the first time these two families, connected by blood and by my terrible mistake, would meet face to face. I spent a sleepless night rehearsing what I would say to Ellen and Chloe. How do you tell your daughter that the child she raised for 54 years isn't biologically hers? How do you tell your granddaughter that her entire identity is based on a nurse's careless mistake? The next morning, I drove to Ellen's house. Chloe was staying with her during the treatment, too weak to be alone in her own apartment. I found them in the kitchen, Ellen making tea, Chloe wrapped in a blanket at the table despite the summer heat. The chemotherapy had left her perpetually cold. "Mom," Ellen said, surprised to see me so early. "What brings you by?" "I need to talk to you both," I said, my voice shaking. "It's important." They looked at me with concern, and I felt a fresh wave of guilt wash over me. They trusted me so completely, had no idea of the bomb I was about to drop. "What is it, Grandma?" Chloe asked, her voice weak but concerned. I took a deep breath and began. I told them everything. The snowstorm, the loose bracelet, my decades of suspicion, the DNA tests that confirmed those suspicions. I told them about Victoria, about Matthew, about the possibility that he could be a matching donor for Chloe. Alan's face went white. She gripped the counter for support. You're saying Chloe isn't my daughter? That for 54 years you've known this might be true and said nothing?" "I wasn't certain," I said, my voice barely audible. "Not until the DNA test last week. I've suspected for years, but I couldn't be sure. I didn't want to disrupt your lives if I was wrong." "But you suspected," Ellen said, her voice rising. "For decades you suspected and you said nothing? Even when Chloe got sick, when we were desperate for a donor, you waited until now to say something?" "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I was afraid of hurting you, afraid of losing you both." Chloe had been silent, staring at the table as if it might hold answers to questions she hadn't even formulated yet. Finally, she looked up. "So this Matthew person, he might be my biological brother?" she asked, her voice surprisingly calm. "Yes," I said. "He's being tested this morning to see if he's a match for the bone marrow donation." "And this Victoria, she's actually your biological daughter?" she asked.
Ellen nodded, seemingly unable to speak. "We're meeting them today," I said, "at Victoria's house. She thinks it's time we all talked." Ellen's hands were shaking. How am I supposed to face this woman, this stranger who is my flesh and blood? What am I supposed to say to her? "I don't know," I admitted, "but Victoria wants to meet you, and Matthew wants to help Chloe if he can." "Of course he does," Ellen said bitterly, "because unlike some people, he didn't wait 54 years to do the right thing." Her words stung, but I couldn't argue with them. She was right. I had waited far too long. "We should go," Chloe said, struggling to stand. "I want to meet them. I want to thank Matthew for being willing to be tested, regardless of what the results show." Ellen looked at her, the anger in her expression softening. "Are you sure you're up for this, honey? It's a lot to take in." "I'm dying, Mom," Chloe said simply. "I don't have the luxury of waiting until I've processed everything. If this Matthew person can help me, I want to meet him. And I want to meet this Victoria, too, this woman who grew up in the life that was supposed to be mine." Ellen flinched at Chloe's blunt assessment of her condition, but she didn't argue.
She helped Chloe get ready, wrapping her in a warm cardigan despite the summer heat, tying a colorful scarf around her bare head. The drive to Victoria's house was silent. Ellen stared out the window, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. Chloe dozed in the back seat, exhausted from even the simple act of getting dressed. I gripped the steering wheel, trying to focus on the road and not on the confrontation that lay ahead. Victoria lived in an elegant colonial in the best part of town. As we pulled up, I saw another car already in the driveway. Matthew must have arrived from the hospital. Victoria answered the door herself, her composure only slightly betrayed by the tension around her eyes. She looked at Ellen first, and I saw a flash of recognition pass between them. Two women seeing their own features reflected in a stranger's face. "Please come in," she said, stepping aside. "Matthew is already here." She led us to a sunlit living room where a tall man in his early 50s stood by the window. Matthew Blackwood had his father's height and build, his mother's dark eyes. He turned as we entered, his expression uncertain but kind. "This is my brother, Matthew," Victoria said, her voice catching slightly on the word brother. "Matthew, this is Ellen Williams and her daughter Chloe." Matthew stepped forward, extending his hand first to Ellen, then more gently to Chloe, clearly mindful of her fragile state. "It's good to meet you," he said. "Victoria has explained some of what's going on, though I'm still trying to wrap my head around it all." "Join the club," Chloe said with a weak smile. "I just found out this morning that my whole life has been a case of mistaken identity." Her attempt to humor broke some of the tension in the room. Victoria gestured for everyone to sit down, then looked at me expectantly. "I think you should explain again, for Matthew's benefit, and so we're all on the same page." So I told the story once more, from the beginning. The snowstorm, the babies, the loose bracelet, my terrible mistake. As I spoke, I watched Matthew's face change from confusion to shock to a kind of sad understanding. When I finished, he turned to Chloe. "So we're actually brother and sister? Biologically, I mean." "So it seems. Surprise." "And you need a bone marrow donor? That's why Mrs. Williams finally came forward with all this." "Yes," I admitted. "Chloe's doctors say a sibling is her best chance for a match." Matthew nodded slowly. "I got tested this morning. They rushed it because of the urgency of your situation. They said they should have results by tomorrow." "Thank you," Chloe said. "Whatever the results, thank you for being willing to help a complete stranger." "Not a complete stranger," he corrected gently. "My sister, apparently." Ellen had been silent throughout this exchange, her eyes fixed on Victoria. Finally, she spoke. "You have my father's chin, and his eyes. I didn't see it before, but now it's so obvious." Victoria touched her chin self-consciously. "I always wondered where certain traits came from. I have the Blackwood name, but never quite the Blackwood look." "No, you have the Williams look, my father's look." The two women stared at each other, separated by decades of living in the wrong families, yet connected by blood in a way that was suddenly, visibly apparent to everyone in the room. "I'd like to know about you, about your life, your family, if you're willing to tell me." Ellen hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, I'd like that too." As they began to talk, tentatively at first, then with growing animation, I watched Chloe and Matthew engage in their own conversation on the other side of the room. Despite the circumstances, despite the shock and the hurt, connections were being formed. Blood was recognizing blood. And I, the cause of all this disruption, sat quietly in the corner, witnessing the beginning of healing that I had delayed far too long. What none of us realized as we sat in that elegant living room was that the real miracle wasn't just that these families had finally found each other. It was what would happen the very next day when the phone rang with news about Matthew's test results.
The next day, Dr. Hamilton, Chloe's oncologist, called with the results of Matthew's testing. I was at Ellen's house when the call came,
helping prepare lunch for Chloe, who had been more tired than usual after the emotional meeting the day before. Ellen answered the phone, listened intently, then broke into tears. For one terrible moment, I thought the news was bad, that Matthew wasn't a match after all. But then she turned to us, her face transformed with hope. "He's a match," she said, her voice breaking. "A perfect match. Dr. Hamilton says it's the best possible scenario, a 10 out of 10 HLA match." Chloe closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. "Thank God," she whispered. "The doctor wants to start the process right away. Matthew needs to begin injections to stimulate stem cell production, and Chloe needs to prepare for the transplant." I felt a wave of relief so profound it made me dizzy. Matthew was a match. Chloe had a chance. My terrible mistake might not cost her her life after all. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of medical procedures and emotional conversations. Matthew underwent the bone marrow harvesting procedure with stoicism, joking that it was the least he could do for a sister he just discovered he had. The cells were processed and given to Chloe, who faced the transplant with a courage that humbled us all. During this time, the two families began the slow, awkward process of getting to know each other. Victoria and Ellen met regularly for coffee, sometimes talking for hours. They discovered shared interests, shared mannerisms, shared allergies even. They were building a relationship, not quite mother-daughter, but something meaningful nonetheless. Victoria introduced Ellen to her children, Emma and Daniel, who were curious about this new grandmother who had suddenly appeared in their lives. Ellen showed Victoria photo albums of her childhood, of the family Victoria would have grown up in if not for my mistake. Matthew and Chloe formed a bond too, strengthened by the transplant experience. He visited her often during her recovery, bringing books and magazines, telling her stories about growing up as a Blackwood. They discovered shared interests, a love of classic movies, a talent for crossword puzzles, and a rational fear of clowns. Little connections that made their biological relationship feel real. I was finding my place in this new extended family too, though it wasn't easy. Ellen's anger at me had cooled somewhat, but there was a new distance between us that pained me deeply. Victoria was polite, but reserved, understandably struggling with the knowledge that I had kept this secret for so long. Only Chloe seemed to have truly forgiven me. "You saved my life in the end, Grandma," she told me one day during a hospital visit. "Maybe not in the most straightforward way, but you did save it." "I should have said something sooner," I admitted. "I was a coward." "Yes, you were," she agreed, with the brutal honesty of someone who has faced death. "But you came through when it really mattered, and look what's come of it. I have a brother now. Mom has found her biological daughter. Two families have become one in a strange way." 2 months after the transplant, Chloe's doctors reported that it had been successful. The cancer was in remission. Matthew's cells had taken root in her bone marrow and were producing healthy blood cells. It wasn't a guarantee. Leukemia could always return, but for now at least, she was healing. To celebrate this milestone, Victoria suggested a dinner at her home, both families together in a purely social setting for the first time. She reserved the entire Sunday afternoon and evening, planning a relaxed meal where everyone could continue getting to know each other. I arrived early, nervous but excited. Victoria greeted me with more warmth than she had shown previously. "Chloe's looking so much better," she said as she led me to the kitchen. "Matthew says she's even talking about going back to teaching next semester." She's always been a fighter, just like her mother, her biological mother, Diana. Victoria nodded, a shadow crossing her face. I wish my parents were still alive to know about all this. It's strange to think they raised a child who wasn't biologically theirs, never knowing. They loved you completely, I said. That much was obvious to anyone who saw you together. I know, she said softly. And Ellen loved Chloe just as completely. That's what keeps me from being angry about all this. Everyone was loved. Everyone belonged somewhere, even if it wasn't where biology intended. The others arrived soon after. Ellen and Bill, Chloe and her husband Tom, Matthew and his wife Susan with their 3 children. Victoria's children, Emma and Daniel, helped set the large dining table, chatting easily with their newfound relatives. Watching them all together, I was struck by the strange beauty of what had happened. Yes, my mistake had caused pain, had separated biological families for decades, but it had also created these 2 strong, loving families who are now finding their way toward becoming something new together. Penny for your thoughts, Mom? Ellen asked, coming to stand beside me. Just thinking about family, I said. About how it's both simpler and more complicated than we think. She nodded, following my gaze to where Chloe and Matthew were laughing about something, their similar mannerisms suddenly obvious now that we knew to look for them. I'm still angry with you, Ellen said quietly. I probably will be for a long time. You had no right to keep this from us for so long. I know, I admitted. I'm sorry. But, she continued, I'm also grateful for Chloe's life and for the chance to know Victoria. Ellen paused, searching for words. She's extraordinary, strong and kind and brilliant. In another life, I would have been so proud to raise her. You would have, I said, if not for me. Ellen was silent for a moment. We can't change the past, Mom. We can only move forward from here. That's what I'm trying to do. As we gathered around Victoria's dining table, I looked at these people who had been brought together by my mistake and by the desperate need to save Chloe's life. Ellen and Victoria, mother and daughter by blood, now tentatively building a relationship as adults. Matthew and Chloe, siblings who had grown up in different worlds, now connected by shared blood in the most literal sense, his cells flowing through her veins, saving her life. And me, the cause of it all, watching as my terrible mistake slowly transformed into something like redemption. 6 months later, Victoria would hand me the first draft of what would become our family story. But neither of us could have predicted how Chloe's next announcement would add yet another unexpected chapter to our already extraordinary tale.
The weeks after the successful transplant brought gradual healing, both physical for Chloe and emotional for all of us. The doctors continued to monitor her closely, but the signs were encouraging. Her blood counts were stabilizing, her strength returning bit by bit. She had begun talking about returning to her classroom in the fall, though Ellen worried it might be too soon. The relationship between our 2 families continued to evolve as well. Victoria and Ellen met weekly for lunch, sometimes with Chloe, sometimes just the 2 of them. They were navigating a unique relationship, not quite mother-daughter in the traditional sense, but something equally meaningful. Victoria had begun researching her Williams family heritage, discovering distant cousins and family stories that explained certain traits and tendencies she had always possessed. Matthew and Chloe had formed a special bond through the transplant experience. My cells, your body, he joked during a visit to her apartment. We're literally blood siblings now. Chloe had laughed, though the medical reality behind the joke was profound. His healthy cells were indeed rebuilding her immune system, saving her life day by day. Ellen's anger toward me had softened somewhat,
though there remained a distance between us that hadn't been there before. She was civil, even warm at times, but the unquestioning trust that had characterized our relationship for decades was gone. I couldn't blame her. I had kept a life-altering secret from her for 54 years, had only revealed it when Chloe's life was at stake. Some betrayals cut too deep for complete healing. Victoria had been surprisingly forgiving. I had a good life with the Blackwoods, she told me during a quiet moment at one of our family gatherings. They loved me, gave me every opportunity. I can't be angry about that, even if it wasn't the family I was born to. They were wonderful people, I agreed. I watched from afar how they doted on you. And Ellen is a remarkable woman, Victoria continued. I see myself in her in so many ways, but I don't regret my life with the Blackwoods. In a strange way, I've been fortunate. I've had 2 mothers, 2 families. Her generosity of spirit humbled me. She had every right to be furious with me for depriving her of her biological family, yet she had chosen to see the positive aspects of the situation instead. Only Chloe seemed to have fully forgiven me. Perhaps facing death had given her a different perspective on mistakes and forgiveness, or perhaps it was simply her nature. She had always had a generous heart, even as a child. You know what's funny, Grandma? As I helped her sort through clothes she had outgrown during her illness, used to wonder why I was so different from Mom. From Ellen, I mean. She's so organized and practical, and I'm always losing things, always daydreaming. Now I know I get that from Diana Blackwood. Matthew says she was the same way. Diana was a dreamer, I confirmed, remembering the elegant woman who had given birth to Chloe all those years ago. Always had her head in the clouds, according to the nurses who knew her. It's strange but comforting knowing these things about myself that never made sense before, like pieces of a puzzle finally fitting together. 6 months after the transplant, Chloe's doctors declared her officially in remission. The cancer was gone, at least for now. We celebrated with a small gathering at Ellen's house, just the immediate family, including Victoria and Matthew, who had become fixtures in our lives by then. As we sat around Ellen's dining table, the conversation turned to the future. Chloe was returning to teaching in the fall, Victoria's daughter Emma was starting college, Matthew's oldest son was getting married in the spring. "We should all be there," Ellen said when Matthew mentioned the wedding. "If that's all right with you and Susan, of course." Matthew looked surprised, but pleased. "We'd love that. Jack and Emily have been asking about Chloe and Tom anyway. They're quite taken with their new aunt and uncle." "One big happy family," Chloe said, raising her glass in a toast, "brought together by a hospital mix-up and a life-threatening illness. Just your typical American family story." Everyone laughed, and I marveled at how far we had come. From the shock and anger of the initial revelation to this, a blended family finding its way forward together. After dinner, as people broke into smaller conversations, Victoria approached me with an unexpected request. "I'd like to record your story, the whole thing, the snowstorm, the babies, the discovery decades later, with your permission, of course." "Why would you want to do that?" I asked, surprised. "Because it's important," she said simply, "not just for our families, but for others. Hospital identification procedures have improved since 1968, but mistakes still happen. And families are complicated. Biological ties, adoptive ties, all the ways we belong to each other. I think our story has something to say about all of that." I considered her request. The thought of my mistake being documented, perhaps shared beyond our families, was daunting. But there was wisdom in what Victoria was suggesting. "I think that's a wonderful idea," I said finally, "though I don't come off very well in the story." "You're human," Victoria said. "You made a terrible mistake, yes, but you also came forward when it mattered most. And because of that, Chloe is alive. That's part of the story, too." As the evening wound down, I found myself sitting on Ellen's porch swing with Chloe. The summer night was warm, fireflies blinking in the garden. For a moment, we were transported back to her childhood, to similar summer evenings when I would tell her stories as we swung in the darkness. Victoria wants to record our family story, I told her. What do you think about that? I think it's perfect, Chloe said. It's a story worth telling. Even the parts about my mistake, my silence all those years? She nodded. Especially those parts. That's where the lesson is. In the mistake, in the secret, and in the courage it finally took to tell the truth. I wish I'd found that courage sooner, I said. So do I, Chloe admitted. But you found it when it mattered most. And because of that, Chloe is alive. That's not nothing. She took my hand and we sat in silence for a while, watching the fireflies rise from the grass. In that moment, I felt a peace I hadn't known since that snowy night in 1968 when I made the mistake that would shape so many lives. There is a reason they put bracelets on babies born in hospitals. I am that reason. My mistake changed the course of many lives, but in the end, it also saved one. And perhaps that was a kind of redemption. Imperfect, but real. What I didn't know then, sitting on that porch swing under the summer stars, was that exactly 1 year later, we would all gather for a celebration that would bring our family's story full circle in a way none of us could have imagined.
1 year after the successful bone marrow transplant, our newly blended family gathered at Lakeside Park for a celebration. It was Chloe's idea, an Alive Day party to mark both her recovery and the anniversary of our families discovering each other. The weather cooperated beautifully, a perfect September afternoon with golden sunlight filtering through the trees. Matthew and his son set up volleyball nets while Victoria and Ellen arranged food on picnic tables. Chloe, now fully recovered and back to teaching full-time, chased her young nieces and nephews around the playground, her energy completely restored. Watching them all together, the Williams and the Blackwoods, now irrevocably connected by blood, by choice, and by shared experience, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. My terrible mistake had caused pain and confusion, yes, but it had also, in this strange way, expanded our family, enriched all our lives. Victoria approached, handing me a glass of lemonade. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, echoing Ellen's question from months ago. "Just thinking about family," I replied, "about how it's both simpler and more complicated than we think." She nodded, following my gaze to where Chloe and Matthew were organizing a three-legged race, laughing as they demonstrated how it worked. Their similar mannerisms were obvious now that we knew to look for them. The same tilt of the head when listening, the same expressive hand gestures when speaking. "The book is finished," Victoria said after a moment. "The editor thinks it will be ready for publication next spring." Over the past year, Victoria had indeed recorded our family's story, interviewing everyone involved, crafting it into a memoir that explored questions of identity, family, and belonging. She had approached it with the same thoroughness and sensitivity she brought to her legal work, creating something that honored everyone's perspective on what had happened. "Are you nervous about it being out in the world? About strangers reading our story?" I asked. "A little," she admitted, "but I think it's important, not just for us, but for others who might be struggling with questions of identity, with secrets, with finding their way forward after difficult truths come to light." She had titled the book The Bracelet. Simple but evocative of the hospital identification that should have kept the babies with their biological families. The bracelet that had been removed, leading to decades of separation and an eventual, unexpected reunion. Ellen joined us, carrying a plate of watermelon slices. "What are you two conspiring about over here?" she asked, her tone light. "The book," Victoria replied. "It's finished." Ellen nodded. "Good. It's a story worth telling." The relationship between Ellen and Victoria had evolved over the past year into something beautiful and unique. Not quite mother-daughter. Victoria was in her 50s after all, long past needing mothering. But a deep friendship built on shared DNA and a growing understanding of each other. They met regularly for lunch or coffee, sometimes bringing old photos to share, sometimes just talking about their lives. Ellen had eventually come to forgive me, or at least to make peace with what I had done.
I can't change the past, she had told me during a difficult conversation some months after the truth came out, and holding on to anger won't help anyone, least of all me. Her forgiveness was a gift I hadn't dared hope for, one I knew I didn't deserve, but I accepted it gratefully, determined to spend whatever years I had left being worthy of her trust once more. Matthew called everyone to gather for a group photo. We assembled on the grassy hill overlooking the lake. Ellen and Bill, Chloe and Tom, Victoria and Jack, Matthew and Susan, all their children, and me. Two families that had become one, arranged in a large semicircle as Matthew set up the camera timer and rushed to join us. Everyone say, "Family!" we chorused as the camera flashed. Later, as the sun began to set and the party wound down, Chloe pulled me aside. "I have something to tell you," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. "We're adopting." "Adopting?" I repeated, surprised. She nodded. "The cancer treatments, they affected my fertility, but Tom and I still want a family. So we're adopting a baby girl from China. She'll be here in about 6 months." "Oh, Chloe," I said, tears filling my eyes. "That's wonderful news." "We're naming her Hope," she continued, "because that's what this year has taught me, that hope can survive even the darkest circumstances, that families can be made in all sorts of ways." I hugged her, too moved to speak. This child from across the world would join our already unconventional family, adding another layer to our complex tapestry of connection. As we drove home that evening, the car filled with leftover food and memories of a perfect day, I thought about the strange journey that had brought us to this point. A snowy night, a tired nurse, 2 babies, a mistake. Cancer, revelation, reunion, healing. And now a new baby coming from halfway around the world to join our family. There's a reason they put bracelets on babies born in hospitals. I am that reason. My mistake changed the course of many lives. But what began in error had transformed over time and with love into something beautiful, a family expanded rather than divided, connections made rather than lost. It wasn't the path any of us would have chosen, but it was ours, and we were walking it together, step by step, into a future none of us could have imagined on that snowy night so long ago. That night, before bed, I took out the photograph Matthew had taken of our blended family, all of us together, smiling in the golden afternoon light. I placed it carefully in a frame and set it on my bedside table, a reminder that even our worst mistakes can sometimes, with courage and love and a measure of grace, lead to unexpected blessings.